Hello and welcome to the new tutorial. In this tutorial we will create several different animations you are watching right now in Blender and After Effects using several different methods. Also we will work more with volumetrics, animation, transition, glitchy effects and similar. The tutorial is also intended for beginners because we will go through all the steps. I also want to make an animation for YouTube channel, so I decided to try to combine different aspect ratios together. So let's start with Blender. You can download Blender for free at blender.org. First, I will introduce you to Blender a bit, after that we will start with this scene. This part is intended for Blender beginners. If you have experience, you can skip this part. Since Blender is a large and complex program, I will try to show you only the basic in about 10 minutes before we start working on the scene. When you open Blender for the first time, we see a lot of options. The good news is that you don't need to know most of them to create a scene. We will spend most of our time on the Layout tab, and we will also use shading for creating materials, UV editor for projecting materials on 3D objects, and finally a bit of compositing tab. All these tabs above are actually made up of these tools here. For example, Layout consists of 3D viewport and timeline because we will use them a lot, so they are here by default when we open Blender. We can create a workspace according to our wishes or needs. For example, if we separate this window, we can add UV editor or shader editor or another 3D viewport here. In the 3D viewport we have three objects by default: camera, object and point lamp as light source. To create a render we must have at least one camera in the scene. To switch to camera view we can go to View, Cameras, Active Camera. But all these options have shortcuts keys. Searching for this option for this menu is waste of time, so if you use Blender you have to learn some shortcuts. We will cover the most common shortcuts in this tutorial, and with time later you can learn shortcuts for advanced options as well. For example, to switch to camera view, the shortcut is numpad 0. When we have a selected camera, in the Properties tab we can find options for this camera. For example, focal length, which is actually zoom, depth of field and others. Each object in the scene can be deleted by delete key or X, and a new one can be created with Shift A or by going to Add menu. We will mostly use the options under Mesh. There we have basic geometry shapes from which we can model anything we want in the edit mode. Once we have the camera and object, we can make the first render. Shortcut for render is F12, or you can go to render image. We now see our object because we have a light source, which is this point lamp. If we remove the point lamp and press F12, we still see something, and the reason is because in the World Properties tab we have a dark gray color but not completely black, which means that our world or environment emits some light. If we switch to black we won't see anything. Lighting in Blender can be from three different types of source. The first is world or environment. There, in addition to color, we can also use an external file called HDRI. We can find many of them on internet for free, and we can also use procedural sky texture which comes with Blender. We create the second group of light with Shift A. There we have point, sun, spot and area. Each of these sources emit light differently. We can also turn any object into a light source if we create an emission material for this object in Shading tab. In Blender we have two render engines. The first is Eevee and the second is Cycles. Eevee is less realistic but is much faster than Cycles. Eevee can be very realistic, similar to Cycles, but you need to know how to set some settings manually, while Cycles is realistic by default because it's a physical-based path tracer render engine. Speed depends on the computer power and scene optimization. In the Properties tab we have different options. One that we will use often is the Modifier tab. There we have a large number of modifiers that speed up the modeling process. For example, the Array modifier enables us to quick and easily duplicate objects. With the Mirror modifier we can easily mirror everything we do on one side to another side. With the Boolean modifier we can cut one object with another. There are many other modifiers. These are just a few that we use most often. The tools on the left allows us to quickly transform the object. For example, we will often use the Move, Rotate and Scale tool, but we usually use them with shortcuts G for Grab, R for Rotate and S for Scale. Most often combine it with X, Y or Z for X, Y or Z axis. For example, if we press S for Scale, then X for X axis, we can scale the object only along the X axis, or RY to rotate only on the Y axis, or GZ to move along the Z axis only. To edit an object we need to go to Edit mode. The shortcut for this is Tab. There we have three types of selection: vertex, edge and face selection. We can jump between them with 1, 2 or 3 on keyboard. Now we can grab vertex, edge and face and scale, rotate or grab with S, R or G. There are a large number of options that we use in edit mode. Some that we use often is Ctrl R to add loop cut, E to extrude and Ctrl B to bevel. Shortcuts that we use often to navigate through the scene is Numpad 1 for the front orthographic view, Numpad 3 for the right, Numpad 9 for the left, and Numpad 7 for the top. You can get the same by clicking on this gizmo. By pressing the N key we open additional tabs. You can find all this in Properties tab and much more, but this is shortcut for this we use often. The first three tabs come with Blender and the rest is the add-ons that I personally install. We will mostly use the Transform tab where we can see location, rotation, scale and dimension. There we can see the dimensions of our selected object.